Ever feel like you're just stuck, in a disagreement and it's like impossible to find any common ground, like you're speaking totally different languages? In today's world, it's easy to feel like everyone's reality is kind of splitting off from each other. But what if we can actually navigate these disagreements, more effectively? That's what we're diving into today with Wikiversity's Finding Common Ground. And this resource is all about aligning our concepts with like actual reality. So get ready to walk away with some, I think, seriously useful tools to not just survive disagreements, but maybe even understand where the other side is coming from. Let's do this. This whole idea of common ground is interesting because it kind of starts with a bit of a paradox, right?
Yeah.
On the one hand, we all experience the same reality, right?
Yeah.
We're bound by the same laws of physics, sharing this like giant universe that we're in. But that shared reality also seems to be a major source of division. You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, think about the sheer scale of the universe. We've, like, barely scratched the surface of what's out there.
Right.
Our individual experiences, as vast and varied as they feel to us, are just a tiny sliver of this massive, complex thing we call reality. But here's where it gets really interesting. This vastness might actually be the key to finding common ground. I'm curious to hear more about this from our expert. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I think what's fascinating is how this vastness, this idea that the universe is so much bigger than we can even comprehend, it encourages a certain humility.
Yeah.
When we grasp how much we don't know, how much is beyond our own limited experience, it becomes easier to accept that other people might hold pieces of the puzzle,
Yeah.
that we're missing. The source talks about worldviews, those mental models that we build to make sense of things. And we all have them, right?
Yeah.
But the worldview that's most closely aligned with reality, that's the most valuable. And the only way to really get there is to be open to being wrong, to expanding our view beyond what's right in front of us.
Yeah, it's like that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Our brains are capable of so much more when we're willing to learn. But speaking of brains, get ready for this, because as our source points out, our perceptions can be uh, pretty unreliable. Seeing isn't always believing, right?
Right.
It turns out we, like, miss things constantly. We distort things. We even add things that aren't really there. The source uses that classic example, the checker shadow illusion, where two squares look like different shades of gray, but they're actually the exact same color. It's amazing how easily our brains can be tricked. Have you ever noticed how this happens in your own life?
Oh, absolutely, all the time. And that's precisely why disagreements can become so kind of intractable. If we're not aware of how subjective our perceptions are, we're more likely to, dig in our heels and assume that our interpretation is the only coagulate correct one. One valuable takeaway from the source is to kind of acknowledge the limitations of our own viewpoints. So instead of saying, this as how it is, which can feel like an attack, try something like, this is how it appears to me, based on my experience. It opens the door for dialogue instead of slamming it shut.
Yeah. It's like we're all looking at the world through, like, tinted glasses, isn't it?
It really is.
And then on top of those tinted glasses, we try to describe what we see with words. And the source calls this representation, how we use language and symbols to try and, like, capture those messy perceptions.
Yeah.
And of course, language itself is inherently limited, which can make finding common ground even trickier. There's this great example in the source. Imagine, like, a paperclip. Infinite uses, right?
Right.
But the second we label it as a paperclip, our thinking narrows. Suddenly it's just for, paper. It makes you wonder, how often do we limit possibilities just because we're stuck on a label?
The paperclip is such a great example of how disagreements often stem from using the same word, but with wildly different meanings, kind of swimming around underneath. Think about a word like bank. It has at least 7 different meanings. Yeah. Or abstract concepts like, justice. It can mean something completely different depending on your personal history, your values, your political leanings.
Yeah.
Everything you've experienced kind of shapes how you see that word.
Which takes us right into interpretation, the next layer in this whole perceiving and disagreeing process. I love the analogy the source uses here, tassiography, or like reading tea leaves.
No, yeah.
What a perfect image. You've got those random shapes at the bottom of the cup, totally meaningless, until the interpreter comes along and kind of assigns them significance, right? And those interpretations are completely colored by the interpreter's own biases and beliefs.
And when you bring that into the realm of disagreements, things get really interesting. Because when the evidence is unclear, which it often is, Our interpretations rush in to fill the gaps. The source uses the example of the satanic panic to
Yeah.
illustrate how powerful and potentially dangerous interpretations can be. This wasn't just a difference of opinion. It had, like, real-world
It's
consequences.
a little chilling, but also a good reminder that this stuff matters, right? It's not just like philosophy, it's about how we understand ourselves and each other.
Yeah.
And speaking of which, the source highlights how humans are like hardwired for storytelling. It's how we make sense of the world, it's how we connect. There's even a whole section on what makes certain narratives stick more than others. Simplicity, unexpectedness, emotional impact. And, well, a good story. We all love a good story.
We do, we really do. And that brings us to the heart of many disagreements. Often we're not arguing about facts, but competing narratives.
Hmm.
Each side is trying to fit the evidence into their sort of preferred story. And the source warns about the danger of this. It says, very often the best story wins, not necessarily the truest. One practical tip the source offers is to, try to identify the underlying assumptions and beliefs that are driving each side's narrative. Because once you understand those, you might find there's more common ground than you initially thought.
It's like that quote, everyone is a hero in their own story, right? And sometimes the real challenge is seeing beyond those hero-villain narratives to find the nuances in between.
It's about recognizing the power of those stories we tell ourselves and each other, and how those stories can sometimes blind us to other possibilities.
Okay, so we've got our messy perceptions, our limited language, those interpretations swirling around. And to pop it all off, we're all drawn to a good story, even if it's not entirely accurate. Sounds a little bleak, right?
Not necessarily. The source actually gets quite hopeful when it talks about finding common ground.
Uh,
But it's not about compromise or one side winning the argument.
because that's usually just a recipe for resentment, isn't it? No one actually changes their mind, they just get better at defending their position.
Right. It's not about winning. It's about understanding. True common ground, according to the source, is found in, reality itself. When we prioritize understanding what is over defending our preconceived notions,
Mm.
that's when we can really connect.
So it's less about like arguing our points and more about becoming better observers, more receptive to what's actually there.
Exactly. It's about approaching disagreements with curiosity rather than, going into battle. And that brings us to ideologies, the final layer in this deep dive. And this is where things can get a little, uncomfortable
Yeah.
because it forces us to look at the belief systems that we often kind of cling to so tightly.
Totally. It's so easy to just like adopt the beliefs of our chosen tribe, whether it's political, religious, even just our taste in music. It's comforting to feel like you belong.
Right. But what's important to recognize here is that ideologies, while comforting, can become like blinders. They can
Mhm.
prevent us from seeing reality clearly because we're so focused on upholding the ideology itself. The source makes this fascinating distinction between what it calls the scout mindset and the soldier mindset when it comes to disagreements. So the scout is curious, open to being wrong, prioritizing understanding over winning. The soldier, on the other hand,
Is ready for battle, defenses up, constantly looking for weaknesses in the other side's argument, which, let's be honest, is exhausting and rarely productive.
exactly, and the source really encourages us to adopt that scout approach,
Mm.
especially with those we disagree with. It's about asking questions like, what led you to that belief?
Hmm.
Or can you help me understand your perspective?
That's such a powerful like shift in thinking, isn't it? It requires a lot of self-awareness to catch yourself. When you slip into that soldier mindset, ready to defend your like intellectual turf. I know I'm guilty of that.
Oh, absolutely. It's an ongoing practice for sure.
Yeah.
But the rewards can be, immense, not just in resolving disagreements, but in enriching our understanding of the world and the people in it.
It's like traveling to a new place and experiencing a completely different way of life. It can be challenging, sure, but it also opens your eyes to new possibilities. And speaking of new possibilities, the source doesn't leave us hanging with all this talk about disagreements. It actually ends on a surprisingly, I thought, hopeful note. It reminds us that finding common ground is possible.
And what's really resonated with me is this idea from the source that finding common ground isn't about one side winning or forcing the other person to change their mind. It's about something much deeper.
Because when you think about it, that kind of superficial winning usually just leads to resentment. No one actually changes their mind, they just get better at defending their position.
Exactly. The source suggests that true common ground is found in reality itself, when our priority is understanding what is, over clinging to our preconceived notions. That's where the magic happens. That's where connection becomes possible.
So it's about letting go of our attachment to being right,
Yeah.
which is tough, but ultimately, I think, freeing.
Absolutely. And this reminds me of a time I completely misinterpreted a situation with a colleague. I was so sure I was in the right. And I built up this whole narrative about their intentions.
Oh, I've been there. It's amazing how convincing those narratives can be, even when they're totally off base.
Right. And it wasn't until I actually sat down with my colleague and asked, hey, can you help me understand your perspective,
Mm.
that the whole situation completely shifted. Turns out I was missing some like crucial information and my interpretation was way off.
It's like that saying, assumptions are the termites of relationships, right? We've all experienced the damage those assumptions can cause.
It's so true. But what's amazing is that when we approach these situations with that scout mindset, with genuine curiosity and a willingness to be wrong, we open up a space for connection and understanding that simply wasn't there before.
And sometimes that shift in perspective can even lead to a stronger relationship than before the disagreement. It's like you've gone through this like crucible together and come out on the other side with a deeper understanding of each other.
Exactly. And that brings us to a crucial point that the source emphasizes, the importance of real good in finding common ground.
Okay, tell me more about this real good idea. I'm intrigued. This feels like the heart of the matter. So, finding that real good is the key, but what does that actually look like in practice? How do we even know if we're seeking real good in those like heated moments, when it's so easy to get caught up in being right?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And the source doesn't offer any like easy answers,
Yeah.
but it does give us this powerful framework for thinking about it. It says, and I'm paraphrasing here a little bit, real good is our common ground.
Hmm.
People seeking real good will find common ground with others who are also seeking real good.
Okay, so it's about like shared intention as much as anything else. It's
Yeah.
not just about wanting to understand, but about the motivation behind wanting to understand.
Exactly. And the source goes on to say, when conflict arises, it is likely because someone is not seeking real good.
Hmm.
Now, that might seem like a bold statement, but let's unpack it a bit. It's not necessarily about someone being intentionally malicious or ill-intentioned. It's more about recognizing that sometimes our own desires for validation, for control, for being right can get in the way of finding that common ground.
Wow, that's really making me think. It's like sometimes we're so focused on protecting our own egos, our own need to be right, that we miss the bigger picture, the shared reality that actually connects us all.
It's so true. And I think the source is really encouraging us to be honest with ourselves about our motivations in these situations. Are we approaching the disagreement with a genuine desire for understanding and connection, or are we primarily driven by the need to defend ourselves, to prove our point? The answer to that question can tell us a lot about where we're really coming from.
It's almost like a self-check before entering any disagreement. Like, okay, what's my real goal here? Am I open to having my mind changed, to finding common ground, even if it means, adjusting my own perspective?
Exactly. And it's not easy. Our egos are powerful things. But the more we can cultivate that self-awareness, that scout mindset the
Mhm.
source talks about, the more likely we are to find that common ground, that shared real good that ultimately benefits everyone involved.
This has been such an insightful deep dive. I feel like I've gained so many valuable tools for navigating disagreements more productively. We've journeyed from those tricky perceptions and interpretations all the way to the power of real good in building bridges instead of walls. What a journey.
It's been a pleasure diving into these ideas with you. It's so important to keep these concepts top of mind, especially in today's world.
Absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, that quote about real good is really sticking with me. It's a powerful reminder that finding common ground isn't just a matter of like logic or argumentation. It's about something much deeper, something that speaks to our shared humanity.
It really does. It's about recognizing that despite our differences in perceptions, interpretations, even ideologies, there's a shared reality that connects us all. And that when we approach disagreements with a genuine desire for understanding and a commitment to seeking that real good, we open up possibilities for connection and collaboration that simply wouldn't be there otherwise.
That's a beautiful thought to end on. So, to our listeners, the next time you find yourself facing a disagreement, remember the power of real good. Ask yourself, what's my real motivation here? Am I approaching this with curiosity and a willingness to understand? By embracing that scout mindset and seeking that shared real good, you might be surprised at the connections you forge and the common ground you discover. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.